just be having a conversation with you, Lindsay. It's really lovely.
Now that we're through the tech part.
Now that we're through the tech part, sort of, my camera is really tilted.
Oh, it's
but is this idea like there's this mythology that books that are about women or even that are by women are only for women. And I think that that is absolute bull. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on your podcast, but and you think about the fact that books like nobody reads Into Thin Air or Touching the Void because they're male focused stories, right? And that's kind of what I wanted this book to be. I just wanted it to be, regardless of who it was about, regardless of the gender of who these climbers were, that it was just a damn good story. Like, that's why we read those books like Into Thin Air, right? Because they are damn good stories. And so
you knew you would have to write a damn good story because you have so many obstacles to climb through to make sure that it was read. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, again, this belief that maybe female writing and female stories just aren't as interesting, or maybe more foofy or are niche, right?
Or female skiing videos, or female, yeah.
Yes, totally, absolutely. I think
we have a lot more to prove.
Yes, and okay, so here's what's interesting. So back in 1970, this is a male-dominated world, so much more so then, right? In 1970, when you think about mountaineering and the mountain world in general. And the popular belief in 1970, this wasn't that long ago, right, was that women were incapable of withstanding high altitudes and savage elements and carrying heavy loads day after day without men's help. And of course, everyone knew their periods made them weaker and prone to hysteria on a monthly basis, right? And it was 55 years ago at this point. We're on the 55th anniversary of this. And that was still so pervasive that I think one of the reasons that the story of this climb was never told, that even in 1970, there also still persisted this mythology that if a woman had achieved a major summit or a major route without a man's help, that route or that summit was no longer worth it for men to climb, right? It became too easy. But you have Denali, which is one of the biggest mountains on earth, right? And so I think there might have been a little bit of, we just won't talk about this. But it's so interesting to me. I mean, we have come so far in so many ways, I think, in the mountain world, but there are still, I think, a lot of obstacles where we have not reached equality. We haven't reached parity in so many different ways. I mean, you can speak to that quite a lot too. And I've written a lot of stories of women in this industry who can very much speak to that. And so I think that the importance of telling stories like this, regardless of the fact that it's just like, this is an amazing accomplishment and it's a great story and it deserves to be told, is that I think we are maybe more than ever in this era right now where we need stories that show women's mettle and bravery and capability, like the influence in what we know of the world, what we're capable of in it, all of this, right? It's so valuable. And we are right now in an era where women's accomplishments are literally being erased from the record. And so we need these more than ever, I think. And so I just am very hopeful that this can just help a little bit with closing that void and showing that there are, regardless of, in a lot of senses, the gender is the backdrop for this, but gender just shouldn't matter anymore in so many different ways.
Well, and that is exactly why I was like, I will help you get this out there, because I'm so grateful for the work you've been doing for years and years to tell female stories at all. Just so they exist, and for committing to that when I know how difficult it is to get them supported, to get them out there, and you stay the course. And I'm so, on behalf of all, not just girls, like all people, thank you for capturing these stories. I can relate so much to the cliffs that I've jumped off where I heard, a guy who thought he was being supportive be like, oh, once you stomp this, no guy will get to hit this again. Like being like, yeah, I think that was, he was trying to be nice. That made me feel awful. And
really, it's just backhanded way.
It was just the truth of, that what we know of things. Anyways, again, thank you. And, tell me more about how this has been received.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have gotten a lot of really great feedback, which has been great. I mean, and also as an author, I have to admit, I'm scared to read reviews and I'm scared to read comments, and I often don't, right? Because it's already so vulnerable to put your work out there. I kind of can't handle, my shell is too thin, I think, even after writing for so many years. But it was covered. What gives me a lot of encouragement, actually, and the fact that we are making headway here is that it was covered when it came out in all of these mainstream magazines like Vanity Fair and Rolling Stone and Time and the New York Times and of course
And Time just called her first book one of the best books of the year. So if you haven't read a Cassidy Randall adventure story, it's worth reading.
Yes, thank
So
you very much.
let's get into this story. 1970, this makeshift group comes together. Like, talk about the characters, who they are, because they're certainly not doing it for Instagram fame, right?
Yes, yeah,
The
exactly.
characters are so interesting.
1970, yes. So this story came to me basically, I wish it was a really good way that a good story in the way that it came to me, but my agent, who also is amazing, and she is one of the only agents out there who is supporting women writers in the adventure space. She's incredible. And so she sent me one day in February, gosh, a few years ago now, was an email, and it was just one line that she wrote that said, "Is there a good story here?" And she linked to this blog post, and it was the Denali National Park blog, and it was just this really short 500-word post commemorating the 50th anniversary of this climb. And I kind of, as I dove in and realized that it was, it was the first all women's ascent, I had this thought, like, if this was such a big deal, like, we should have heard about this by now, right? Like, we should know about this the way that we know Lynn Hill freed the nose in the 90s. It should just be this like household name, but I'd never heard of it. And so that alone drew me into wanting to write this story. But then what also drew me into it, the first thing that you do when you're writing nonfiction narrative is you go and make sure that there's enough to actually write a story, right? It's not writing fiction. You can't make stuff up. Everything has to be correct. And is there enough for a book? And the first character, for lack of a better word, the first woman who drew me in about this climb was the woman who ended up leading it. Her name was Grace Hoeman, and she was this Alaskan climber out of Anchorage. And at the time that she led the climb, she was actually 47, which in itself is rare when you think about ageism too in mountain sports, but particularly when you're a woman. But she was just this really fascinating woman. Her entire life is archived at the University of Alaska in Anchorage, including this really tragic love story. But I think almost what got me before that was that Grace, so before she ended up in Alaska, she was actually raised in Holland and in the 1920s. And as she got older, she decided she wanted to become a surgeon at a time when less than 4% of doctors were women. And she wanted to become a surgeon, which was the highest sort of level of physician that you could be at the time. And she decides, simply because it's the best university, to go to medical school in Berlin in the heart of World War II. So she goes into Nazi Germany to get her medical degree, to brave that. And part of that reason too is I'm sure that Nazi Germany was taking all of the good educators and all the good doctors. They were all concentrated in Berlin. So Grace goes to brave that. She's really young. And by the time her first year is out at university, when she's 21 years old, and this is just a snapshot into who this woman is, who has this audacious idea, right, that she's going to climb Denali with all these women. So before her first year is out in medical school, she's fallen in love with a fellow doctor. She has had their first child. And then the year after, he's shot in combat, killed. She's pregnant with their second child. And she finishes out her medical degree while single parenting, pregnant, running for the bomb shelters when the air raid sirens go off with her, 2-year-old in tow, finishes out her medical degree. When she is done, Grace's mother hops on a bike from Holland, cycles into wartime Germany, procures a bike for Grace, and the two of them cycle this tiny little family out of the rubble of Third Reich Berlin. So this is Grace Hoeman. She ends up in Alaska years later and has been on a couple of climbs where she has been, she feels like it has been hard for her to be the only woman. And one of those actually was, she was on the ascent that was still to this day ended up being the worst tragedy in Denali's history back in 1967 when this storm hit the mountain. And this group was, they were stranded on top, and the winds of this quicksilver storm, they clocked in at like 300 miles an hour. Grace is in an expedition that's about halfway down the mountain. They know that this expedition is trapped at the top. They know that they need help. Grace is a doctor, right? Super helpful in that situation. She's experiencing some altitude sickness, and the lead climber says, well, you have to go down. You can't come up with me. You're not going to be able to overcome this, basically. And she thought that was because she was a woman. But then more than that, and what spurred her to lead this climb, and what I found in the archives that just drew me in, was what I was talking to you about a few days ago, Lindsay, is this tragic love story with her and her husband. So she falls in love when she moves to Alaska with another Alaskan climber. And the year after this horrible Denali tragedy where she's sent down and those 7 men die on top of Denali, her husband, Vin, is asked to co-lead this expedition to Dhaulagiri 1 in the Himalaya, and it's a National Geographic-sponsored expedition. Nobody's ever climbed Dhaulagiri. At that time, it was considered one of the hardest peaks. Vin is asked to help put together the team, and he puts forward Grace, his wife, to be part of the team, to Boyd Everett, who's the leader of the team. And Grace probably had more experience than half of the men who were put forward for this team. She had solo first ascents to her name. She'd climbed on several continents. She'd been to, 25,000 feet in South America. She could do it. And Boyd writes back saying, Grace actually has illusions of grandeur and light experience, and she won't be coming on this expedition. And then Vin ends up dying on Dhaulagiri in this massive ice avalanche, and he never comes home from the Himalaya. And she ends up with this heavy weight of survivor's guilt and thinking, had I been there, had any women been there, would different decisions have been made? And so then she gets this audacious idea that she's going to lead an all women's climb up Denali, and she's going to prove everyone wrong that women can do this.
Yeah, that's a good story. That's a story worth telling. Wow.
And then when you think of who the other women are, and the way these women all came together was almost like you couldn't write it as fiction. Like you couldn't even come up with these coincidences and these fateful paths that were really, really wild. But one of the women that she essentially collides with through fate is Arlene Bloom, who's a really well-known climber who's still alive today in Berkeley. And Arlene becomes the deputy leader of this climb. And then it's 4 other women, 2 other California climbers, and an Australian and a Kiwi. So it was an international group. And what was really wild about these women is that they weren't just occupying the fringe and being women and climbing. They were doing things that at the time women did not do, right? Like Margaret Young, who was this wayward member of the Forbes family that you would never know she had astronomical wealth. She was more of kind of like a pack rat and a hoarder, but she was a physicist and a mechanic and a small plane pilot because she wanted to fly into these remote spots to go climbing. Arlene was a chemist. Margaret Clark, the Kiwi, was a geologist. If there was anybody who could overcome these barriers or who could withstand the pressure, basically, of what they were facing as being the only women to attempt this, it was these women who already were used to navigating these worlds, right? And they were so, in some senses, of course, they cared what people thought. And in other senses, they did not care at all what people thought, which is really, I think, a rarity to be able to see that in our literary canon of women who are historical figures. And I feel like the one more thing I want to say, and then I'll let you ask more questions, but that's the other thing that drew me to this story, is that all 6 of these women, they were complicated women. And I think too often in our sort of narrative, women have historically only been allowed to play the roles that we've been assigned. And we all could name them, right? It's like princess, witch, lone heroine, damsel in distress, and you're supposed to be likable, or we're villainized for being unlikable. And these women, like, there was not a clear-cut saint or sinner among them. They were just their own people. They were on their own arcs of development. They all had different reasons for why they were doing this. They all had different pressures and stakes they were carrying up the mountain. And that, to me, was so cool. Like, in the beginning, Grace Hoeman, I thought that she was incredible. She was my favorite person out of the entire story. And by the end, when it's turned into this survival story, this wild ride inside the heads of people who were facing a life and death situation, I wanted to throttle her for the decision she was making. So, and that I find so compelling.
Exactly. I let you go because, yeah, these characters are so important for us to know about, to know that they exist, because they're so much more relatable than the characters we're getting on a daily basis that are fed to us by these devices, especially, or by the classic stories. And another reason why the story is so important. Do you want to go into a bit of the story? It is such a good story.
Sure, yeah. So it starts in 1967 on the slopes of Denali with that massive storm about to hit. And what I love about that is the fact that Grace went back to the mountain after she had been there. I mean, the storm was not as strong as it was at the top, but she experienced it. She was very close to what it could do. Her husband, Ben, was on the relief team that went up to try and identify the bodies. And she still wanted to climb that mountain. And it gave me this opportunity to get inside the heads, like the heads of all of us who do. I mean, I'm not a mountaineer like that. I'm more of a ski mountaineer, and not even, a really gnarly ski mountaineer. But why would somebody do this and be able to translate that to people who have never even thought about why, right? And that actually was my favorite part to get to write, was why do we go back to these things where, we're so uncomfortable, and there's this thin layer between life and death. Like, who wants to do that? Why, right? So that was really cool to get to talk about that. And then it kind of
That's really hard to capture too.
Yes,
So
it is. I think it is.
really
And
hard to
I'm
write
sure I
about or
miss so
describe.
many things, right? Like, we get like, why do you do those things, Lindsay?
Right. Nobody can ever answer that
Yeah.
in typical with the words we have. Yeah.
Yes, totally. And then the story brings together these threads of these different women, really with these three main women, which are Grace, Arlene, and the Kiwi, Margaret Clark. And a lot of the reason for that is simply because the most still exists on them. There are two of the women, Margaret Young, the Australian faker, like nothing. There's like zero that is left about them except the memories, right? Or maybe their journals. Actually, those two didn't even have journals. And then it kind of goes into a backdrop of what the narrative of climbing was at the time and what these women were facing. I mean, the insults that were hurled at them were just like, you couldn't make this up. Again, like, here, wait, let me find some. No way dames could ever make it up that bitch. Women don't have what it takes, not that imaginative. But my favorite one, women should be able to climb Denali more readily than men. After all, they have all that extra insulation. So they were dealing with all of this, and this idea that cat fights would break down the team, and just all these tropes, right? And as if that weren't enough, there were these obstacles out of their control that they were facing before they even went to the mountain. So Margaret Young, she was doing this first winter ascent in the Eastern Sierra. She falls 900 feet down a slope as they're training to climb Denali, miraculously survives. Arlene broke her leg in a spiral fracture in a ski accident. Dana falls deep into this crevasse as she was descending Shasta alone after a practice climb. I mean, it could have gone wrong any number of ways, right? Let alone the fact, so Arlene writes this letter to Grace shortly before they actually all convene to climb the mountain. And she says, we can't be all that accident prone. After all, no one got pregnant. Because, right, this was a time where the idea of motherhood and the mountains were not compatible, and still in many ways are not compatible, right? But this was a time when that would have shut the door for sure on this climb for any of those women. And you needed a team that was about as big as they had to climb the mountain the way that people were climbing mountains then. So had they lost somebody last minute, it would have been a disaster. And then we get on the mountain, And just like the way people climb mountains in 1970 was so hard. Like what they were doing, carrying just hundreds of pounds of equipment, just siege style, establishing these camps, and the equipment they were using to do it. I mean, you should see the pictures of these snowshoes. They're like these 3-foot monstrosities that people are trying to just like clomp up the mountain with. But what starts to happen is we start to see the social dynamics that are inevitable in any big group when you get into sort of elemental situations, particularly in high altitude, right, where our brains get impacted and our bodies and our emotions. And we start to see these choices being made. And the choices reflect the pressures that these women were under, both individually and collectively, until, and I don't want to give it away, but they're facing life and death by the time they get to the top of the mountain. And they have to make these decisions about who will they save? Will they save them all? Will they all die, basically? And the fact that I could get into their heads is only a product of these amazing journals that 4 of the women kept. And it is something that I think has maybe been missing a little bit in mountaineering literature too, to be able to get inside heads like that and break down choices. Yeah, in this really vulnerable way, which was really cool to do.
Yeah, it's so needed. You're such a godsend.
Thank you.
It's the way to do it, right? It's just Netflix. Are you listening? Like,
yes,
this is a no-brainer. I was always curious how they funded that first expedition.
Yes, so they're basically just like saving out of pocket. But one of the main ways that's, and I was telling you earlier on that they could not get the kind of sponsorship they hoped for. So they did not have monetary sponsorship at all. They had very little gear sponsorship. They had a tent donated, some food donated, some underlayers. They went to National Geographic and said, will you cover this? If we'll take pictures. And Nat Geo said, no, but send us your pictures after you've taken them and maybe we'll run something if you do it on your own dime, basically. Never did, obviously. So the one thing that gave them any funding was this study that was happening in Fairbanks at the time that was really interesting. It was run by the Army through the University of Fairbanks, and the Army was studying high altitude climbers on Denali for the physiology because they wanted to translate it to winter combat. And to date, that institute had refused, according to Grace's correspondence, had refused to test any women who had been part of any mixed climbs up on Denali, which at that point, there literally 2 women had stood up on top of Denali at that point anyway, and they had been part of mixed groups. And they had said, no, we don't want to study those women. But they changed their tune for some reason. There's no evidence as to what it was, but, and so they paid the participants of those studies, and that payment covered the women's flight into base camp on Denali. And essentially everything else was on their own dime at the time. And, they didn't have a lot of money. They were teachers and students. And I mean, Grace had a fair bit, I suppose, but still at the time, it wasn't that much.
I don't know if I want to ask too many more questions because I certainly don't want to give it away. But they're just so relatable.
I know.
And I feel like our heroes these days are less relatable.
Yes. This is
so
something
so nice
actually that I was talking to, who Christina Lustenberger is?
Of course.
Lusty, yes.
Of course.
So Lusty and I had been talking about this because
I've been trying to get her on the podcast.
Yes!
She responds to all my texts except the podcast.
Because she hates talking about herself.
I know, but she needs to.
I know. She's incredible.
Incredible.
But I had this kind of realization as I was talking to her, and then it ended up in part of the coda of this book. We were talking about how in these typical hero's journeys, right? You expect people to be playing these certain roles, and the roles are supposed to be perfect, and our heroes are supposed to be perfect. And that's because we expect our heroes to have figured out everything with which we're still struggling. And what pressure, oh my God, right? And I just think I'm at the point, even when I'm reading things or the people that I look up to, I kind of want them to be messy and complicated and not have it figured out, right? Like, I do think our heroes should be a little bit messy.
Love it, and that's why you're a good writer.
Thank you.
Well, I can't say that I've ever done this official sort of book interview type, interview, so thank you. Is there anything that we missed? Where can people find the book?
Yeah,
Um
you can find it anywhere books are sold. I'm a big fan of supporting local bookstores, and if they don't happen to have it in, they'll order it for you. So, big fan of that. It's also I couldn't listen to the audio version, but there's an Audible book. I just I didn't narrate it because it's a grueling thing, and I didn't want to hear how somebody else narrated it. But I hear it's really good. It's good narration, so you can also listen to it.
Go dyslexia folks that need things read to them. Awesome. Uh, I don't know, is there anything
Well, can we do a little bit of a reverse interview to get people who are watching kind of up to date on where we are now in the mountain world? Where I can ask you some questions?
You bet.
Are you up for that?
You're so good at it.
Well,
I
I
feel like
definitely
just give people a little context. We connect every couple of years, and we sort of I know I, from a distance, just see what you're doing, and am so grateful that you're telling these stories. And it's been a couple of years since we've connected. We've done a couple, I guess we've had a couple print projects together.
Yes. Yes. So I think I first got to talk to you, Lindsay, about this for the series that I was doing for Outside. Gosh, that must have been 5 years ago, I think, but it was on motherhood in the mountains.
Mm.
It was a three-part series where it was talking about how are people handling the decision to have children or not have children in these big mountain professions that rely on, um, high endurance, which requires a lot of training, that are high risk and that often require being gone from home for long periods of time, right?
Mm.
And so fast forward maybe 3 years, I don't remember, but then I had reached out being like, "I need some cool stories to tell," and you had this amazing story that we got to work on for Backcountry, basically kind of about mysticism,
Mm.
but also about this idea of how do we make these choices about things that are going to impact the way we think of ourselves and our careers. And speaking of mythology, because we've talked a lot about like mythology and roles and things like that in this conversation, like there has been this, and it's not really a mythology because it's kind of been true that like motherhood and big mountains don't go hand in hand easily. And at the time you were really kind of deciding what your highest role was and could it involve both. And now you're a mother of two little ones, like you are in it. And I want to hear your perspective on where you think the mountain world is now and what it's like to be a mama in the big mountain world.
Uh, Thank you. Thank you for asking. It's always such a treat just to be able to speak, right? And the two things that first came up for me, especially with this story, knowing that these women uh, encountered this in the 70s and that I could relate so much in this decade, was hard for me. One being that, so when I made Pretty Faces, the first um, multi-sport action sports film for women on Kickstarter, everyone told me it would fail.
Mm.
And everyone was like, and we basically, without knowing, you knew that if it did fail, you were going to let all women down everywhere, because this would be pointed to in that, yeah, see that it was tried and it sucked. You know what I mean? So that pressure that these women in your book felt, they could not feel because they were representing everyone.
Yeah.
And then secondly, having to overcome these mass agreements, in terms of what the female body was capable of.
Yeah.
So being told that I couldn't jump off this cliff because the female body was incapable of withstanding the impact, and having to accept that within myself and really ask if that was true, and if my body was willing to decide that was, you know, to challenge that.
Yeah.
And so those sort of experiences that the big mountains gave me, to me, are so incredible, but also just more evidence of where we're at. And
Yeah.
I don't mean to be negative or anything, but to see us going backwards, for what feels like the first time in my lifetime, is also difficult. So that's why I think these conversations are so important, to have a voice, if we can, while we can,
Yeah.
for anyone listening. And just again, thank you for getting these stories out there and these characters. In terms of where I'm at personally, it's pretty much what I expected. But also, you know, the industry has shifted. I can't take anything personally. It's always been an honor to get to live any sort of this life. And at the same time, some of the same problems that I encountered when I first came into the sport, for example, not having the stiffest boots available for a female in my size, or not having the ski equipment that I needed to really get after it. To know that those are still not, because smaller guys and strong women and juniors are not a majority of the market segment, we are generally not going to see skis and boots in those sizes. And that's just a fact of what I was told many times, of like, it's just economics. So that's hard. It's hard to know, but like to have been in this position for as long as I have, and to see those, that they're just where we're at. And at the same time, I'm so grateful to, you know, maybe get into a boot that doesn't fit perfect, or a ski, and have an opportunity to try it at all, you know.
Yeah.
So especially given the situation in the greater scheme of things, if we're talking about skiing and mountaineering, like, we're pretty fucking lucky. So
yeah, that's true.
So it is not gotten any easier as a female and as a mom in order to keep sponsorships going and that sort of thing. I've definitely diversified, and I'm learning. I'm in a big learning phase, and at the same time, I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah.
I never got this job like for a job, you know. I've never called this a career. So grateful to just keep trying to get to go skiing and go powder skiing. I offer trips. I'm guiding at Jackson Hole. I get a few media gigs here and there, modeling little like on mountain stuff here and there, and definitely have a few sponsors that are still being supportive, and a new film project that I have partially funded, about my cousin AJ, one of the pioneers of big mountain skiing, and her story, which is super inspiring. And so I don't know if that's another podcast, but that's what I have going on. And then these two little ones, which are absolutely the best thing ever. That's my update.
Yeah, you have your hands full. You know what I think? I don't know if you've gotten this since you had your kiddos, but what I always thought was kind of insulting was this idea of, you know, do you make decisions differently about risk now that, you know, you have your kids? I was like, why are they only asking women that? Do they think dads don't care? They're not making decisions differently? I would imagine that's not true.
Yeah. I really love the comments that are being left. They're really insightful.
Yeah, they're great. Really intelligent.
Well,
should we call
anything
it?
Else? Yeah, I think, you know, we made it. We've got live, and it's been awesome. Thanks again. I can't wait to share this book more, and let's go skiing.
Thank you so much for your support of women, Lindsay. It's invaluable. I so appreciate it. Yeah.
Likewise. Or how about just good stories, right?
Good stories. Yes. Support of anyone.
Yeah. All right. Bye, girls. Awesome. Thanks for everybody who actually watched.
Yeah.